Rome conquered Britain, Egypt, Greece, half the known world. But there was one civilization it never conquered: India. Not because Rome couldn't fight, not because India was impossible to reach, but because invading India would have been one of the biggest mistakes in Roman history. And if that's true, then where did all of India's wealth go? How did the richest civilization on earth become what it is today? The answer begins 2,000 years ago. Here's the obvious guess: India was simply too strong, too well defended for Rome to even attempt it. Not quite. India's kingdoms were powerful, yes, with armies that included something Roman legions had never faced in large numbers on any battlefield. War elephants capable of shattering a disciplined infantry line through sheer size and terror alone. But strength alone rarely stopped Rome. It had defeated stronger, better defended enemies before. Something else made this particular gamble too dangerous to take. Here's the twist: the danger wasn't losing a single battle, it was everything that would have happened afterward. Picture the map the way a Roman general would have actually seen it. Between Rome and India sat an entire empire: Parthia and later the Sassanids, controlling every land route an invading army would need. Rome fought Parthia for centuries and never once broke through cleanly enough to march past it and keep going east. Wait. So the real obstacle wasn't India at all, it was everything standing in front of it. Here's something that should surprise you. At Carrhae, one of Rome's most humiliating defeats in its entire history, an entire Roman army under a wealthy general named Crassus was wiped out by Parthian cavalry using mounted archers Rome had never fully countered. Thousands of miles short of India, nowhere near its actual border. That defeat became a permanent warning etched into Roman military memory for generations afterward. If Rome couldn't reliably beat the empire directly in its way, an empire it bordered and understood after centuries of contact, marching thousands of miles further into unfamiliar terrain against unfamiliar armies and war elephants it had never faced in force, wasn't strategy. It was a recipe for losing an entire army with no way to ever get it back. Now, flip that idea upside down, because here's what almost nobody considers: Rome wasn't even the first great power to learn this lesson. 3 centuries earlier, Alexander the Great, arguably the most successful conqueror in ancient history, had already tested exactly how far an army could push into India, and paid for it in a way history rarely forgets. Alexander crossed into the Indus Valley in 326 BCE, fresh off conquering the entire Persian Empire, an achievement no one before him had managed. He defeated a local king named Porus at the river Hydaspes in a battle made especially brutal by something his soldiers had never faced in this way before: war elephants, dozens of them, terrifying his cavalry and trampling formations that had crushed Persian armies with ease just years earlier. Alexander won that battle, but something happened afterward that no enemy had ever managed to force on him directly. His own soldiers refused to go any further. Standing at the edge of the Ganges plain, facing rumors of an even larger kingdom ahead with thousands more war elephants and an army that dwarfed anything they'd yet encountered, Alexander's exhausted troops simply stopped marching. Years of continuous campaigning, thousands of miles from home, had worn down even history's most successful army. Alexander reportedly wept in his tent, furious at being denied the chance to push further, but he turned back anyway, because an army that refuses to march can't be ordered into a war it no longer believes is winnable. If Alexander the Great, undefeated in battle, couldn't convince his own soldiers to go any deeper into India, that wasn't a warning Rome ever needed to learn firsthand. It was already sitting in the historical record, 300 years old, for any Roman general willing to read it, because here's what almost nobody considers. A failed invasion of India wouldn't have just cost Rome soldiers. It could have cost Rome its reputation, its treasury, and possibly its eastern frontier all at once, inviting every enemy watching to strike while Rome's best legions bled out on the other side of the world. Here's a scene worth sitting with. Imagine a Roman commander advancing east past the last friendly outpost his men would see for months, supply lines stretching thinner with every mile, every river crossing a fresh risk. By the time news of a defeat reached Rome, carried by messenger over thousands of miles, an entire army could already be gone, buried in foreign soil, with no way anyone back home could have prevented it in time. That's not weakness. That's arithmetic, plain and unforgiving. Empires only conquer as far as their logistics can follow them and survive the trip back. Here's something stranger still. Rome's most ambitious eastern conquest, under the Emperor Trajan, pushed only as far as Mesopotamia, modern-day Iraq, a fraction of the distance to India. Even that conquest was abandoned almost immediately after Trajan's death because holding it cost more than the empire could sustainably commit. If Mesopotamia alone proved too costly to hold, India was never a serious possibility at all. And yet Rome and India were connected constantly, just not by armies. Roman ships used seasonal monsoon winds to sail directly across the Arabian Sea to Indian ports, trading glass, wine, and gold for spices, gems, and fine textiles that couldn't be produced anywhere closer to home. Roman coins have been found buried in hoards across southern India to this day, sometimes in surprising quantities, alongside a detailed sailing guide from the period describing Indian ports by name. Here's an I never thought about that moment. Rome had every incentive to keep that trade running exactly as it was, undisturbed, year after year, and almost no incentive to risk it on a war that could easily destroy the very army sent to fight it. Conquest was expensive, slow, and uncertain. Trade was already profitable, low risk, and required not a single soldier to maintain. So India stayed unconquered by Rome, not through invincibility, but through distance, timing, and a risk no Roman emperor judged worth taking. But here's where the story turns. Because Rome walking away wasn't the end of outside powers eyeing India's wealth. It was only the beginning of a much longer story. For most of the next 1,000 years, India remained one of the wealthiest regions on earth, producing textiles, spices, and finished goods that flowed along trade routes reaching Europe, Africa, and China. Often traded for silver and gold that European merchants had few other goods to offer in exchange. By some historical economic estimates, India accounted for a substantial share of the entire world's economic output well into the 1700s, a scale of wealth and manufacturing capacity that, by many measures, dwarfed most of Europe at the time, built on centuries of skilled textile production, agriculture, and long-distance trade networks. What changed wasn't Rome, and it wasn't any single event. It was the arrival, many centuries later, of European trading companies, first Portuguese, then Dutch, French, and eventually British, who came initially for trade the same way Rome once had, but who possessed something Rome never did: naval technology capable of projecting force reliably across entire oceans, combined with the ability to exploit deep political fragmentation among competing Indian rulers who were often at war with each other. Over roughly 2 centuries, control shifted gradually from trade to territory to direct rule. And India's economic output relative to the rest of the world declined sharply as colonial-era policies reshaped local industries, taxation, and trade patterns to primarily benefit the ruling power rather than the region itself. Traditional textile production, once a major source of India's wealth and global trade dominance, faced new tariffs and competition that shifted advantage decisively toward British manufacturing. Economic historians continue to debate the exact scale and causes of that shift, and the topic remains genuinely contested among scholars. But the broad pattern, from a dominant share of world economic output to a small fraction of it within roughly 200 years, is widely documented across multiple independent estimates. So here's the real takeaway. Bigger than the question I opened with, Rome never conquered India because the risk never made sense for an empire that had to march there, hold it, and survive the journey home. But the wealth that made India worth conquering in the first place never disappeared on its own, and it never simply vanished by accident. It was redirected centuries later by powers with different tools, different technology, and a very different kind of patience than any Roman general ever had access to. Not every empire that shaped India's fate ever set foot there with legions, marching in formation behind a standard. Some arrived quietly, generations apart, with ships and trading contracts instead of swords, and changed permanently everything Rome once looked at from a great distance and decided wisely not to touch.